Picture a little stick figure standing at the edge of a mountain cliff in 9th century China, staring up at the night sky with wide, hopeful eyes. His tiny stick arms are stretched out toward the stars. His round, circle head tilts back. He isn't a warrior. He isn't a general. He isn't a king. He is just a monk. A monk with one enormous dream, and that dream is the most human dream there is. He wants to live forever. His name is Wei. At least, that is what we will call him, because history never bothered to write down the name of the man who accidentally changed the entire world. Wei lives in a small wooden workshop clinging to the side of a mountain in the Sichuan province of China. The year is somewhere around the 9th century, and Wei has dedicated his entire life to a single purpose. He is going to find the elixir of immortality. He is absolutely certain of it. The recipe exists somewhere in the ancient scrolls that fill every corner of his workshop, stacked on shelves, rolled and tied with string, piled in corners so high that Wei has to push them aside just to find room to sit down. He has read every single one. He has taken notes on every single one, and for years, one patient experiment at a time, he has been working his way through the possibilities. We watch Wei's daily routine in those early scenes, and it has a certain devoted, slightly manic quality that is genuinely endearing. He wakes before sunrise, stokes the fire under his small clay furnace, and begins the day's work with the same quiet determination a carpenter might bring to shaping a table. He measures, he mixes, he heats, he writes down what happened. He starts again. The furnace glows orange in the dark workshop. Smoke curls upward through a hole in the ceiling. Weighs round little head bobs with concentration as he leans over his workbench, tiny stick fingers carefully combining whatever the day's recipe calls for. Some days it is copper and mercury. Some days it is a mysterious red powder a traveling merchant sold him at considerable expense. Some days it is a combination of minerals he found described in a scroll so old the edges had crumbled to dust between his fingers. None of it has worked, not yet. But Wei is not discouraged. He is patient in the way that only truly devoted people can be patient, the kind of patience that doesn't count the years because the years don't matter compared to what is waiting at the end of the search. He is 43 years old. He has been doing this for 20 years. He will keep doing it until he finds the answer or until he dies. And the entire point of the project is that he intends to make sure the second option never arrives. On the morning that changes everything, Wei is working through a particular recipe he found in a scroll that had been sitting on the bottom of his tallest shelf for a decade, ignored because it didn't look promising. The recipe calls for three things: saltpeter, which Wei knows well, a white crystalline substance found in caves and on certain rocks, used by healers for generations, and called by its formal name potassium nitrate; charcoal, which Wei has in abundance because he uses it to heat his furnace; and sulfur, a yellow powder with a smell like something the earth itself has been trying to get rid of, which Wei keeps in a sealed clay pot at the far end of his workbench because the smell gives him headaches. We watch Wei measure these three ingredients with careful precision. His tiny stick hands scoop the white saltpeter into a small stone bowl. His tiny stick hands add the black charcoal. His tiny stick hands unwrap the sulfur pot, hold his round head away from the smell, and tip in a careful measure of yellow powder. He picks up a small wooden stick and begins to mix. So far, so normal. Wei has mixed 1,000 combinations in this workshop over 20 years. He isn't nervous. He isn't even particularly hopeful about this one. He is just working the way he works every morning. Then he leans toward the furnace to check the temperature, and a single ember floats free from the flame on a tiny draft of air, and it drifts almost lazily across the workshop, and it settles directly into the stone bowl of Wei's freshly mixed combination of saltpeter and charcoal and sulfur. What happens next takes approximately 1/10 of a second. We see it in slow motion because no animator could resist. The ember lands. There is a single instant of stillness that seems to stretch out across time. And then the mixture does something that no previous mixture Wei has ever made in 20 years of patient experimentation has done. It erupts. Not with a gentle chemical glow. Not with the slow, sedate reaction Wei has come to expect from most of his experiments. It erupts with a sound like a thunderclap inside a small room, with a flash of orange and white light that fills the entire workshop, and with a force that sends Wei's round circle head snapping backward and launches him clear off his stool and directly into the tall shelf of scrolls behind him, which collapses onto him in an avalanche of ancient recipes and mystical texts. Wei sits in the rubble of his workshop, buried to the shoulders in collapsed scrolls, with a look of absolute blank astonishment on his face. His eyebrows, which were considerable, are gone. Just gone. So is roughly half of his beard, which had been his pride for 15 years. The front of his robes is blackened. The stone bowl is cracked in two. The furnace itself has a scorch mark across the front as though something tried to fight it and lost. Smoke fills the workshop from floor to ceiling. And Wei sits there in the silence that follows the most dramatic 10 seconds of his life, with his ruined beard and his missing eyebrows, and he stares at the space where his mixture used to be, and he thinks. He thinks for a long time. Then he reaches for a new piece of paper and begins to write down exactly what just happened. Because Wei is a scientist, even if the 9th century hasn't invented that word yet. He is a scientist who has just witnessed something that doesn't fit into any category his 20 years of study have prepared him for. This was not a medicine. This was not an elixir. This was not the quiet glow of a reaction approaching something divine. This was an explosion. This was pure, violent, instant, spectacular energy released all at once from what looked for all the world like a bowl of ordinary powder. And Wei, beardless and eyebrowless and somewhat shaky, begins to understand that he hasn't found what he was looking for. He has found something else entirely. He doesn't know yet what that something else is. He only knows that he needs to do it again. He does it again. He does it carefully this time, outdoors, in the small courtyard behind his workshop, with a long stick to apply the flame from a safe distance. He mixes the saltpeter and the charcoal and the sulfur in the same proportions. He sets it in a small stone dish. He retreats. He applies the flame, and the mixture explodes again, smaller this time, in the open air, but just as fast, just as absolute, just as startling even when you are expecting it. Wei stands in his courtyard with his singed robes and his missing beard and watches the smoke curl up from the stone dish. And he nods slowly, the way a scientist nods when a result confirms exactly what his notes told him to expect. He calls his new discovery Huo Yao, fire medicine. He writes the name at the top of a fresh scroll in his most careful brushwork, and begins the long work of understanding exactly what he has made. Here is where the story could easily have ended. Here is where, in a reasonable world, Wei might have noted the discovery, filed it away as an interesting but useless curiosity, and gone back to his search for immortality. The mixture explodes. Interesting, but it doesn't cure disease. It doesn't seem to extend life. It doesn't glow with divine light. It just explodes. What is the use of something that just explodes? We follow Wei through the weeks after his discovery, and we watch him wrestle with this question in the way that genuinely curious people wrestle with unexpected things. He experiments. He varies the proportions. He notices that more saltpeter means a bigger, faster explosion, while less means a slower burn. He discovers that the mixture can be shaped, that it can be packed into a tube, and the explosion will travel outward in one direction with concentrated force. He discovers that burning it loosely produces fire and smoke, while confining it tightly before ignition produces something considerably more dramatic. He fills scrolls with observations. He grows a new beard, though it takes time, and the patchy early weeks are not his best period aesthetically. He begins to think of Huo Yao not as a failed medicine, but as a phenomenon in its own right, something that deserves to be understood on its own terms, regardless of whether it ever leads back to the immortality problem. And in this way, accidentally and slowly, and without any of the drama you might expect from the beginning of one of history's most consequential stories, a 9th century monk with a ruined beard and a curious mind begins to document the basic properties of gunpowder. The years pass. We mark them with a simple device in the animation, a small counter in the corner of the frame that ticks forward, 1 decade at a time, while the world around Wei's mountain slowly changes. Villages grow. Roads widen. More travelers pass through the foothills below his workshop. And the scrolls Wei has written The careful records of his work with Huoyao begin to circulate the way ideas circulate in a world before printing, slowly, imperfectly, hand to hand, workshop to workshop, copied and recopied and carried across distances that would have seemed impossibly vast to the monk who first wrote them. 2 centuries pass in this way, the counter ticking quietly, while somewhere in the world, other stick figures read about Huo Yao and experiment and add their own observations to the growing body of knowledge about this extraordinary substance. And then a different kind of stick figure enters the story. Not a monk, not a scientist, a soldier. We meet Commander Zhang during the Song Dynasty. He is a broad-shouldered stick figure in a general's hat, and he has a problem that all generals throughout history have shared, which is that the enemy is doing something he doesn't have an answer for. His walls are thick, and his soldiers are brave, and his archers are skilled, but the enemy has more men and more time, and eventually enough men with enough time can bring down almost any wall. Zhang stands on the battlements of his city and looks out at the besieging army spread across the valley below him, and his tiny stick face wears an expression of the particular misery of a commander who knows the math and doesn't like the answer. His advisor appears at his elbow. The advisor is a smaller stick figure with a long beard, and he is carrying something, a bamboo tube, roughly an arm's length, lashed securely to the end of a long spear. The inside of the tube is packed with huoyao. Zhang looks at this device with the appropriate skepticism of someone being offered an unusual solution to a desperate problem. His stick, arms, cross. His round head tilts. The advisor gestures enthusiastically. They test it that night, away from the walls, in the courtyard of the command post. A soldier holds the fire lance. The advisor applies flame. And the thing erupts, spewing fire and burning debris from the open end in a sudden roaring gout of orange and smoke that makes every soldier in the courtyard take an involuntary step backward, regardless of how much they knew it was coming. Zhang watches, his arms uncross. His head tilts the other way. He looks at his advisor, who looks back with the face of someone who has correctly predicted that this moment would arrive. The defense of the city uses fire lances against the attackers climbing the walls, and the effect is exactly as Zhang had hoped. The fire lances don't kill every attacker. They don't need to. What they do is something more powerful in that moment, which is that they completely destroy the psychological certainty of soldiers who have spent their entire lives learning to fight with swords and spears, and have never in their lives faced an enemy who could project fire itself across the space between them. We watch attackers on the scaling ladders flinch back from the sudden roar and flash. We watch them hesitate. We watch the hesitation spread sideways along the line like a wave, one soldier seeing the next one pause and pausing himself, the whole assault losing its momentum in the crucial seconds when momentum was everything. Zhang watches from the battlements, and for the first time in this crisis, his face shows something like relief. Fire medicine has become a weapon, and once that door opened, history walked through it and never looked back. The next stick figure in our story appears 100 years later, and he is very different from Commander Zhang. He is an engineer, and he is obsessed with a specific practical problem that the fire lance left behind like an unsolved puzzle waiting for the right person. The bamboo works beautifully right up until the moment it doesn't. And the moment it doesn't is when the charge inside it is powerful enough to split the bamboo itself, occasionally in the hands of the soldier using it, which is exactly as unpleasant as it sounds. The engineer's name in our story is Long, and Long has the kind of focused, slightly tunnel-visioned expression that engineers in every century wear when they are deep inside a problem that nobody else fully understands yet. We watch Long try different materials. Thicker bamboo. Multiple layers of bamboo bound together. Treated bamboo. All of them fail at some point under a sufficiently large charge, splitting or bursting in exactly the way the problem predicts they should. Long fills his own scrolls with failed experiments, and there is a long sequence in the animation where we watch him work through one frustrating iteration after another, each time packing the tube, stepping back, applying flame, watching the result, and then writing something down in his notes with the expression of a person who has just confirmed that they were right about something going wrong. And then Long gets access to a bronze casting workshop, and everything changes. The first cast bronze tube that Long tests is a revelation that plays out in our animation with appropriate drama. The tube is small. It looks almost toy-like, a short, thick cylinder of orange-red metal mounted on a wooden stock. Long packs it carefully, with huo yao and a small rounded projectile of hardened clay. He steps behind a wooden shield. He applies the flame, and instead of the crack and burst of splitting bamboo, there is a tremendous boom of contained and released energy, and the clay projectile punches through a plank of wood across the courtyard with a force that makes Long's round head visibly move from the sound pressure alone. He walks slowly to the wooden plank and looks at the hole. It is clean and round and goes completely through. Long puts one stick finger through the hole and looks at it from the other side. He turns around. He picks up his notes. He begins writing very fast. The hand cannon exists. It is crude. It is slow to reload. Aiming it is more prayer than science. But it is bronze, which means it can contain the full force of the explosion rather than breaking around it, which means the projectile receives all of that force rather than some fraction of it, which means the projectile travels faster and farther and hits harder than anything a fire lance could ever produce. Long has taken Wei's accidental discovery and pushed it into a new dimension, and in doing so has laid the foundation for every firearm that will follow him across the next 1,000 years. We take a moment in the animation to show what is happening inside the tube when Long fires his hand cannon, because it is one of those moments where understanding the mechanism helps the story make sense. The saltpeter in the gunpowder mixture is doing the essential work. When the flame touches the mixture, the saltpeter releases oxygen instantly, the way a person might take a deep breath to blow on coals, except this breath happens in a fraction of a second and produces an explosion of gas that expands outward with enormous force. The tube confines that expansion to a single direction. The projectile sitting in that direction receives the full push of all that gas behind it, and it flies. Everything that follows in the next 1,000 years of firearms development is essentially an attempt to do this same basic thing, just more reliably, more quickly, more accurately, and with more force. The chemistry doesn't change. Wei's accidental discovery in his mountain workshop is still the essential heart of it. Everything else is engineering. Now, the counter in the corner of the animation starts ticking faster, because the next chapter in our story arrives not as a slow accumulation, but as an event. A single catastrophic historical force that sweeps across Central Asia and carries gunpowder technology westward with a speed that no peaceful trade route could have matched. The Mongol invasions begin, and the Mongols are coming. We introduce the Mongol general as a new stick figure, this one wide and confident and wearing a distinctive helmet, seated on a horse that is also stick-figured and appropriately magnificent. His name, for our purposes, is simply the General, and he is leading an army that has already conquered most of the known world by the time his forces arrive at the walls of China's great cities. The General has fought battles across plains and mountains and deserts. He has broken armies that seemed unbreakable. He believes, with the particular confidence of someone who has been correct many times in a row, that his forces can overcome any obstacle. But the obstacle waiting for him at Kaifeng in the year 1232 is different from anything the general has encountered before. The defenders of the city fire their cannons at his advancing troops. They launch explosive bombs from behind their walls. They use devices that trail, fire, and smoke and noise in combinations that his horses hate and his soldiers find deeply unnerving. The general watches from his command post as his assault waves falter against a defense he didn't know how to anticipate, and his face in the animation shows something he isn't accustomed to showing, which is a version of uncertainty. But the general is not a man who stays uncertain for long. What he cannot overwhelm immediately, he studies. What he cannot defeat in the first assault, he surrounds and waits for and watches, carefully noting everything the defenders do that works. He is, above all things, a fast learner, and the Mongol military machine is a fast-learning organism. When Kaifeng eventually falls, the general's forces don't just take the city. They take the engineers, they take the craftsmen who know how to make the cannons and the bombs and the fire medicine. They take the knowledge itself, folded into the army like a new piece of equipment, carried westward with the next wave of conquest. This is the detail that our animation pauses on, because it is genuinely one of history's more remarkable accidents. The Mongol conquests were brutal and devastating by every measure, but they were also, unintentionally, the fastest technology transfer in the pre-modern world. Gunpowder knowledge traveled from China to the Islamic world to the edges of Eastern Europe within a few generations, not because anyone planned to share it, but because the Mongol army simply carried it everywhere it went. The general's stick figure is shown in a map sequence, his small horse-mounted silhouette moving westward across a simplified rendering of Eurasia, and wherever he goes, a small, orange spark of gunpowder knowledge is left behind. We follow one of those sparks. A craftsman in the Islamic city of Damascus, a stick figure with a jeweler's careful hands, gets access to one of the captured Chinese devices through a chain of traders and military intermediaries too complicated to trace precisely. He turns it over in his hands. He examines the bronze casting. He notes the touch hole and the proportions of the barrel. He begins, in his own way, and with his own tools and his own materials, to understand what he is looking at. He already knows about saltpeter because Islamic physicians have been using it medicinally for generations, just as Wei once did. He understands the chemistry of combustion better than most of his contemporaries. What he is looking at is not a complete mystery. It is a machine for doing something he can now almost, but not quite, articulate. He starts experimenting. He fails many times. He writes down his failures with the same patient precision that Wei showed in his mountain workshop 3 centuries earlier and half a world away. And gradually, through the long process of incremental understanding that drives all real invention, he begins to get results. Meanwhile, we track a parallel path in the animation. A second small spark moving along a different trade route toward the northwest. Knowledge of gunpowder reaches European travelers through a combination of diplomatic contact, merchant networks, and the intellectual exchanges happening during this extraordinary period when Chinese, Islamic, and European scholars were all reading and building on each other's work in ways that wouldn't be properly appreciated for another several hundred years. An English scholar named Roger Bacon writes about a mysterious explosive substance in the 1260s. A German friar named Berthold Schwarz is associated in some accounts with early European experiments. The exact path of transmission is genuinely murky, which is itself a kind of historical truth. This knowledge arrived not as a gift with a bow on it, but as a rumor confirmed by experiment, a piece of a puzzle that people across multiple cultures were independently trying to assemble. The stick figure who represents early European gunpowder technology is shown in our animation as a monk, deliberately echoing Wei from the beginning of our story, hunched over a workbench in a stone monastery, surrounded by manuscripts in Latin and Arabic both. He has a translation of a Chinese text that describes the proportions of the mixture. He has his own saltpeter, mined from the walls of caves near the monastery. He has charcoal and sulfur. He has everything he needs, except confidence, because the text is incomplete and his translations are imperfect, and his first 3 attempts produce results ranging from nothing to a small fire to a moderately alarming flash that singes his own eyebrows. Completing the circle back to Wei in a way that seems almost too perfect but is genuinely documented in the historical record. His 4th attempt works. The scene in the animation plays out in parallel with Wei's original discovery, because that is what it deserves. The same slow buildup, the same application of flame, the same instant of anticipation that stretches like taffy before the explosion arrives, the same tremendous boom. The same singed monk sitting backward on his stool with a look of astonishment on his face. And in the corner of the frame, the counter reads 1300s. Which means that between Wei's burned beard and this monk's burned eyebrows, roughly 4 centuries have passed, and the basic human experience of encountering gunpowder for the first time has not changed at all. The European canons that follow are crude by later standards, but astonishing by the standards of the time. They are cast in bronze, following the basic template that long established in China, scaled upward to sizes that required wheeled carriages to move and multiple men to operate. Loading 1 requires ladling in the powder and the projectile from the front end, ramming it down with a long stick, applying the flame to the touch hole, and then stepping well to the side before the whole arrangement fires. It is slow, it is temperamental, It misfires with uncomfortable regularity. And in the early days, the accuracy is best described as optimistic, since aiming essentially means pointing the barrel in the approximate direction of the target and hoping. But there is one thing early European cannons do very well, and it is the one thing that matters most in the military landscape of medieval Europe. They knock down walls. We introduce the next key stick figure in our story as a siege engineer, a lean and calculating stick figure who stands in front of a medieval castle and looks at it the way a carpenter looks at a piece of wood he is about to cut. The castle has stood for 200 years. Its walls are 4 meters thick at the base. Every previous siege of this castle has failed because the walls cannot be climbed faster than defenders can knock attackers off, cannot be tunneled under without the defenders noticing, and cannot be starved out in less time than the besieging army can survive in the field. The castle is, by all previous military logic, essentially impregnable. The siege engineer has brought cannons. The animation shows the next sequence with satisfying efficiency. The cannons are positioned, the powder is measured, the cannonballs are placed, the fuses are set. And then, methodically, over hours and then days, the 4-meter walls of the castle begin to come apart. Not all at once, not spectacularly, just gradually, shot by shot, as each iron ball punches a little deeper into stone that has never before been asked to absorb this kind of repeated impact. The defenders on the walls watch this process with the dawning horror of people who are watching the thing that made them safe stop being true. Their walls were their guarantee. Their walls were their power. Their walls were, in a very real sense, their entire social position in the world. And the walls are coming down. The castle falls. And the siege engineer looks at his notes and begins planning the next one. What follows in the decades and centuries after that moment is a cascade of consequences that ripples outward in every direction from that basic fact about wall breaking. The lords and kings, whose power rested on the ownership of impregnable castles, begin to find that impregnable is no longer the right word. The political order of medieval Europe, which was built on the reality that a wealthy man with a strong castle could hold territory against almost any force, begins to shift underneath their feet. A new kind of power is emerging, the power of whoever can afford the most cannons and the most gunpowder, which turns out to favor larger and wealthier kingdoms over smaller individual lords, which means the age of feudal fragmentation is slowly and inexorably drawing toward its end. But the wall breaking is only one part of what gunpowder is doing to European warfare during this period. Because while the cannons are doing their work on fortifications, smaller versions of the same basic technology are being developed for individual soldiers to carry. And those smaller weapons are going to change the equation on the open battlefield in a way that is just as profound as what the cannons are doing to castle walls. The hand cannon comes to Europe in various forms during the 1300s, and in the animation we watch a new stick figure trying to use one. He is a soldier, bulky with armor, and he is discovering that the hand cannon has the same fundamental usability problem that Long identified in China. You need to aim it, but you also need a second hand to apply the flame to the touch hole, but you only have 2 hands, and one of them is already occupied holding the thing steady, which means you are trying to do 3 things with 2 hands, and one of them involves fire, which tends to occupy your attention even when you are used to it. This soldier's solution, born of frustration on a cold, rainy afternoon at a testing range outside a German city whose name history has not preserved, is to prop the barrel of the hand cannon on a forked stick pushed into the ground, which frees both his hands to manage the powder and the flame simultaneously. It is not elegant. It is not reliable. It is absolutely going to misfire the first time he tries it in real combat because something always goes wrong when you need it not to. But it is a step, the first small step toward a mechanical solution to the problem of how you aim a gunpowder weapon and fire it at the same time with only human hands. The matchlock mechanism arrives in the early 1400s, and in the animation, its inventor is shown having a moment of insight that every engineer recognizes, even if they haven't personally experienced it, the moment when the solution suddenly appears fully formed, obvious in retrospect, completely invisible until it wasn't. The insight is simple. Instead of holding the burning cord in your hand, Hold it in a mechanical clamp attached to the weapon itself. Pull a trigger. The clamp lowers the burning cord into the priming powder. The priming powder ignites the main charge. The weapon fires. And throughout this entire process, both of the soldier's hands have been free to hold and aim the weapon. We watch the matchlock arquebus in action in the hands of a trained soldier, and the difference from the hand cannon is immediately visible. The soldier holds the weapon naturally against his shoulder. He looks down the barrel toward his target. He steadies his breathing. He pulls the trigger. The sequence is recognizable. It looks, for the first time, like shooting a gun in a way that we would recognize if we saw it today, because this mechanical firing mechanism is the conceptual ancestor of every trigger mechanism that follows it for the next 5 centuries. The animation follows the matchlock arquebus outward from Europe along 3 distinct paths, because this is a story about the migration of knowledge as much as it is about invention. We watch the Ottoman army under Sultan Selim incorporate matchlock weapons into their elite Janissary infantry, the disciplined professional soldiers who form the backbone of Ottoman military power. We watch the matchlock arrive in Japan in 1543, carried by Portuguese traders whose ship was blown off course in a storm and made landfall at the island of Tanegashima. And we watch local Japanese gunsmiths take the Portuguese matchlock apart, study every element of its construction, and begin producing their own versions that some observers consider among the finest firearms manufactured anywhere in the world during that period. This Japan sequence gets particular attention in the animation because it illustrates something important about the story being told here. The Japanese gunsmiths don't just copy the Portuguese design, they improve it. They refine the metalwork. They develop new manufacturing techniques that produce barrels with more consistent tolerances. They create a design specifically adapted to the Japanese climate and the preferences of Japanese warriors. They take someone else's invention and make it distinctly their own, adding to the accumulating body of knowledge the same way every other contributor in this story has done. Wei, adding to the inherited tradition of Chinese alchemy. Long adding to Wei's discovery of the mixture, Zhang adding to Long's bronze tube, the European craftsmen adding to the knowledge brought westward by the Mongol campaigns. Nobody starts from nothing. Everybody builds on what came before. We return to Europe for the next major development, and we introduce the wheel lock through a stick figure who is the most specific kind of specialist this story has produced yet, a cavalry officer. He is mounted, elegant, in the animation, even in stick figure form, and he has a problem that the matchlock has not solved. He cannot carry a loaded matchlock on horseback with the slow-burning cord already lit, because the cord gives away his position in darkness, because the cord can go out in rain or wind, and because managing a burning cord while also managing a horse in combat is one task more than any reasonable person should have to juggle simultaneously. The wheel lock solves this by replacing the burning cord with a mechanical spark. A spring-loaded steel wheel spins against a piece of pyrite and generates sparks automatically when the trigger is pulled, with no flame, no cord, and no countdown. The cavalry officer's stick figure is shown in the animation examining his first wheel lock pistol with the expression of someone who has just been handed the thing they have been waiting for their entire career. He holds it up. He looks down the short barrel. He pulls the trigger. It fires. And the spring in the mechanism does the spark work for him, cleanly, reliably, without burning cord or open flame or any of the management that has been the practical burden of every gunpowder weapon since Zhang's soldiers first lashed bamboo tubes to their spears. Wheel locks are expensive. The mechanism is complex, with more parts than a matchlock and tighter tolerances required in the manufacture, which means only craftsmen with exceptional skill and appropriate tools can make them well. This keeps them out of the hands of ordinary infantry for decades. But among cavalry, among the wealthy, among those who can afford the premium, the wheel lock spreads quickly and permanently changes how firearms fit into the cavalry's tactical toolkit. But the real breakthrough, the mechanism that finally solves all of the problems at once, arrives in the hands of a French gunsmith named Marine Le Bourgeois, and it arrives in the form of something that looks almost too simple to be the solution. The flintlock. In the animation, Le Bourgeois is shown as a small, precise, stick figure in a craftsman's apron, working at a bench covered in springs and small metal components, with the focused expression of someone who is very close to something important. He picks up a piece of shaped flint. He picks up a spring-loaded hammer that grips it. He fits these pieces into a mechanism and closes the pan cover and the hammer in a single integrated component so that when the trigger releases the spring, the hammer swings forward, the flint strikes the steel cover of the pan, sparks spray directly into the priming powder below, and the charge fires. He tests it. It fires. He tests it again. It fires again. He tests it in the rain, covering the pan carefully and then uncovering it only at the moment of firing, and it fires. He tests it in the dark, and it fires without giving away his position with a burning cord or a visible flame. He tests it after it has been sitting loaded in a drawer for 3 days, and it fires. Every previous ignition mechanism required management between uses. The flintlock requires almost none. It is ready when you need it, in the way that a reliable tool is ready without demanding constant attention. We watched the flintlock mechanism spread across Europe during the 1630s and 40s with a speed that reflects how good the solution actually is. The Dutch military adopts it as standard issue. The French cavalry transitions away from wheel locks. The English infantry, fighting the Civil War with a mix of old matchlocks and new flintlocks, begins to standardize around the newer mechanism. Within a few decades, the flintlock is the dominant firearm mechanism across essentially every major European military, and it will hold that position for nearly 200 years. During those 200 years, we follow a simplified version of the world in the animation. The small stick figures moving across maps and battlefields in patterns that trace the outline of a historical transformation. The flintlock armies of Europe carry their technology into the colonial period, arriving on coasts around the world with weapons that represent a significant technological advantage over what most of the people they encounter can field. This part of the story is presented carefully in the animation, because the history of what firearms enabled is not a simple tale of progress. The same technology that a French cavalry officer used to ride with his wheel-lock pistol, the same chain of innovation that began with Wei's singed beard in a mountain workshop, arrived on the coasts of Africa and the Americas and Asia in the hands of people who used it to claim and conquer and enslave. The animation acknowledges this without editorializing, showing the small stick figures of colonized peoples facing flintlock volleys across a stark visual gap that represents not just a difference in weapons, but a difference in historical circumstance that gunpowder helped create, and that the world is still living with today. And through all of this, the architecture of the world is changing. The castles that European cannon fire began dismantling in the 1300s have been replaced by a completely different kind of military structure. The Star Fort, designed by engineers who understood that the new reality of artillery fire required not tall walls but low, angled, massively reinforced ones. The Star Fort's distinctive geometric shape, all jutting angular bastions and overlapping fields of fire, is the built environment's response to gunpowder, the physical world reshaping itself around an explosion that began in a monk's workshop on a Chinese mountainside. We show this in the animation with a time-lapse sequence where castles slowly transform into star forts across a stylized European landscape, the towers shrinking down, the walls spreading out and thickening, the whole silhouette flattening toward the earth, as though the buildings themselves are instinctively trying to make a smaller target. The battlefield is changing too. We return to the infantry stick figures and show what European armies look like during the height of the flintlock era, the mid-1600s. The armies that once combined pikemen and musketeers in carefully choreographed formations are transitioning into something new. The socket bayonet, introduced in the late 1600s, is the piece of hardware that makes the transition possible. Earlier bayonets plugged directly into the muzzle of the musket, which meant you couldn't fire the weapon while the bayonet was attached, which meant you had to choose between shooting and stabbing, which meant you still needed separate pikemen around to protect the musketeers while they reloaded. The socket bayonet clips around the outside of the barrel instead. The muzzle stays clear. The weapon can still fire with the bayonet fixed. And suddenly, every soldier is both a shooter and a spearman in the same body, at the same time, with the same weapon. The need for separate pikemen disappears. The entire, complicated, expensive, training-intensive system of combined pike and shot formations becomes unnecessary overnight. Every infantryman now carries a single weapon that covers both functions, and the armies that were once a mixture of roles become, at least in their basic organization, a single unified force of armed soldiers who can fight at range and close range both. We show the final major figure in our story at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, a stick-figure infantryman in a British redcoat standing in a line with hundreds of others, each one holding a flintlock musket with a fixed bayonet. This soldier represents the endpoint of a chain of development that began with Way's saltpeter and charcoal and sulfur in a clay bowl. And he doesn't know any of this history. He knows how to load his musket in under 30 seconds. He knows how to fire on command. He knows how to fix his bayonet and charge when the order comes. He knows what the man to his left and the man to his right are supposed to be doing and what he is supposed to do when one of them goes down. He is a product of the same chain of incremental refinement that produced the weapon in his hands. Each generation of soldiers training on the lessons of the previous one, the knowledge accumulating, the same way the mechanical improvements accumulated, slowly, incrementally, person by person. The percussion cap arrives in the early 1800s, and our soldier doesn't know about it yet, but it is coming. The percussion cap is a small metal capsule containing a shock-sensitive chemical compound that explodes when struck by the hammer, replacing the flint and steel and priming powder that have been the final link in the ignition chain since Le Bourgeois assembled his first flintlock in 1610. When it arrives, it will make the flintlock obsolete with the same efficient ruthlessness that the flintlock showed toward the matchlock, and the matchlock showed toward the hand cannon, and the hand cannon showed toward the fire lance. The technology doesn't stop. It hasn't stopped since Way's mixture exploded in its clay bowl, and he picked up his pen and began writing it down. Now the animation slows. The counter in the corner, which has been racing forward through centuries, pauses. And we zoom back, pulling the camera outward from the individual stick figures to show the whole sweep of the story from above, all the different stick figures in all their different settings and centuries connected by a single, thin, glowing line that traces the path of the knowledge from Way's workshop in the Sichuan Mountains westward through China and through the Mongol campaigns and through the Islamic world and into the workshops of European craftsmen and out across the ocean to the corners of the world where the technology ultimately arrived. The line is not straight. It doubles back on itself. It branches. It sometimes disappears into uncertainty for decades before reappearing in a different place. It carries not just the chemistry, but the accumulated refinements, each person in the chain adding something, none of them completing the picture alone, each of them essential to what came before and what came after. Wei and Long and Zhang and the general and the Damascus craftsman and the European monk and the matchlock soldier and the wheel-lock cavalry officer and the French gunsmith and the British infantrymen at Waterloo are all connected by this line, all part of a single unbroken chain of human curiosity and problem-solving and accidental discovery that spans 9 centuries and every inhabited continent. And in the final scene, we pull back far enough to see the beginning and end of the line simultaneously. At one end, Wei sits in his mountain workshop, missing his eyebrows, writing his notes by candlelight, convinced that the key to immortality is still somewhere in the scrolls around him, unaware that he has already accidentally done something more durable than living forever. At the other end, somewhere in the early 19th century, a percussion cap clicks into place in a rifle that is more accurate and more reliable and more capable than any weapon in the previous 1,000 years of development, and the soldier holding it knows none of the history it carries inside it. The animation lingers on both images side by side. The monk writing, the soldier aiming. One looking for a way to live forever, the other holding the distant result of that search. And between them, the thin, glowing line of everything that happened in the 9 centuries in between. Then the camera zooms in one final time, not on the soldier, not on the weapon, not on the battlefield, on Wei, on his ruined beard and his missing eyebrows and his clay bowl with the crack down the middle, on the scroll he is writing on, and the careful brushwork of the characters he is laying down, describing exactly what he observed and what he measured and what he thinks happened. On the act of writing it down, of not letting the accidental explosion simply be a frustrating incident that burned his beard and wrecked his workshop, but treating it instead as a piece of information worth preserving, worth understanding, worth recording carefully, so that someone else someday might pick up where this moment leaves off. Because that is the actual story being told here. Not the story of a weapon, not the story of a war. The story of what happens when a curious person writes something down. The story of what happens when knowledge passes from one set of hands to another, across languages and borders and centuries, each person adding their own small piece before passing it on, none of them able to see where it will eventually go, all of them essential to how far it travels. The story of the unbelievable distance that a single idea can cover when it is never allowed to stop moving. Wei finishes his sentence. He sets down his brush. He looks at the clay bowl with the crack down the middle. He is already thinking about what proportion to try next. He doesn't know that he is the beginning of something. He only knows that he wants to understand what just happened, and that understanding it matters, and that writing it down carefully is the only way to make sure the understanding survives longer than he does. He picks up his brush again. He begins the next sentence. Outside the window of his mountain workshop, the night sky is full of stars, and the stars are not going anywhere. He has work to do.